All right, everyone. Welcome to our June Ivy Talk, which is helping us kick off our celebrations of Juneteenth. We are very excited to be hosting this Ivy Talk this evening. I'm Susie Farmer, the Education Director at Ivy Creek Natural Area and Historic Riverview Farm, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you all this evening. We are very excited to have Dr. Lynn Rainville with us tonight, who is talking on the preservation of African American cemeteries in the Piedmont region. Dr. Rainville received her BA from Dartmouth College and her master's and Ph.D. from the University of Michigan. She spent the last 2 decades studying Virginia's historic cemeteries, enslaved communities, segregated schools, poor farms, and its role in World War I. Her grant-funded research has produced numerous articles and books. And after 15 years as a college professor, she founded an Institute for Public History and Historic Preservation at Sweet Briar College, and later served as the dean and chief academic officer. In 2019, she moved to Lexington, Virginia, to begin a new chapter in her career as the executive director of institutional history and the museums at Washington and Lee University, where she is also a professor of anthropology, and we are very excited to have her here this evening. Just a couple housekeeping items before we begin. This is being recorded and it will be posted to our website in a few days. If you have not muted yourself, please do so. And if you have questions, please put those in the chat box and we will answer those questions at the end of the presentation. So Lynn, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Susie, for inviting me this evening. We are going to make sure that does this work, Susie? It's still working? Great. So I figure I'll speak for, maybe 35 minutes, and then happy to take any questions or engage in any conversations that folks might want to have. My goal today, and looking at who's here, we have folks on this call who are way more knowledgeable than myself about African-American families and cemeteries in Charlottesville and Albemarle. And then we also have folks from different states. So I'll be trying to do 2 things here. One is talking broadly, no matter what state you're in, all of our states have historic African-American cemeteries that are really important in terms of understanding American history. And then also I'll have some specifics about Ivy Creek for those of you who have actually been to Ivy Creek or who are local and would be encouraged to visit Ivy Creek. So 2 different things here based on it at this point about 20 years of research. Actually, it is about 23 or 24 now here in Virginia on these sacred sites of African-American history. So the first step, again, in any of your regions would be how we relocate these historic cemeteries. And 2 quick examples here. On the left-hand side, this is a cemetery for enslaved families down at Sweet Briar College. Sweet Briar, before it was a college, was a plantation with an enslaved labor force of over 150 individuals. And the pattern you see here, you're obviously looking at fields, and then the fields have these natural boundaries that are like literally trees and natural boundaries that are enforced by fences. And then you see the circle of trees with the empty space. Well, the cemetery, though, is within that small cluster of trees that you see here in the middle. And that's a common pattern for how to relocate these sites within rural landscapes. On the right-hand side is unfortunately what happens if you don't proactively locate, relocate, and or protect these important sites. So everywhere you see an orange flag, each orange flag is numbered and is an association with a gravestone. This is also an antebellum cemetery for African-American families. This is down in Alta Vista, Virginia, about 2 hours south of Charlottesville. And unfortunately, what happened here was it was the same sort of pattern. It was a cemetery for enslaved families within a former wheat field. but a farmer about a century ago, the stones were in the way of his cattle. And so he took up all the stones, and you can see a large tree, the tree that has the poison ivy on it, on the left-hand side. So he moved all the stones, he desecrated the site and moved all the stones out of the way. Now, subsequently, they have done GPR at this site, and they have made an effort to relocate where the burials are and to ensure that they can protect them. Other siting of these cemeteries. These are two examples from Albemarle County. You see on the left, again, these hilltop sites are a very important pattern to these cemeteries. The idea of burying up on a hill, you're closer to heaven. You're also above the water table, which makes it much more practical in terms of burying bodies. And then on the right-hand side, this is a church cemetery in Albemarle County, and you see the yucca plants. I've heard a bunch of different kind of folk tales about these, but my favorite one is that the reason why they're in cemeteries is because, for those of you who are familiar with this plant, they are very pokey on the top. And the story goes that they plant them in cemeteries so that if the devil comes to visit, he won't want to sit down. So I point out some of these ecological features of the landscape itself, but then also plantings. And we'll come back to that later, why those are sometimes really important for relocating these cemeteries. So the other important context for these cemeteries is, of course, the cultural one. These cemeteries don't exist in a void. They're connected with historic Black churches, neighborhoods, families, and schools. So in this particular instance, this is a church and a school associated with the Rose Hill neighborhood, which is just alongside Monticello. And in turn, there is a historic cemetery here that's actually located about a quarter of a mile away. So it was a little bit more difficult to locate that cemetery. But it's, again, once you start putting the pieces together, it's not just a cemetery in the middle of nowhere, it's connected to this historic Black community. So as I alluded to a moment ago, in some cases, sometimes these cemeteries, of course, they've never been lost or forgotten. I should add that this is one of the reasons why Black cemeteries are more greatly impacted by this kind of cultural amnesia of where they are, has a lot to do with after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, the outmigration of Black families, and not just to the north, but sometimes into cities, but further away from wherever their homes had been. And that makes it difficult for different generations to recall where, 100 years ago, a family member was buried. Because I think any of us, especially if we've moved from wherever we're from, especially before the internet, if you were to ask them where your great grandparents were buried, you might not have that at the top of your head. And in this particular instance, in the center is Mr. William Hearns, Billy Hearns, who lives in Milton, Virginia, also near Monticello. And what you're looking at going left to right, believe it or not, the picture on the far left, that is his family cemetery. And this was a classic story. Mr. Hearns was born and raised in Albemarle, but then he went to serve in the Army, and he was gone for about 40 years. And when he returned, what land that had been in his family, it had been owned by his grandmother, that had been sold out of the family. And he was incorrectly told about maybe 40 years ago now that the land that his grandmother, where his family cemetery was located, on the land that his grandmother owned, that now that his grandmother didn't own the land, it would be trespassing if he went onto it. Now, this again is still part of this, well, racism among other things, but that was at the very end. I'll talk about some state statutes here in Virginia that provide access to cemeteries, family cemeteries. But instead, what happened was I got a call about 15 years ago from a neighbor who lived nearby who said that she had always been told there was a cemetery in her backyard, i.e. the woods, and she was wondering if I could try to relocate it. I went out for hours. I could not find it, in part because if you look at that picture on the left, since there are actually gravestones in there, but they're very hard to see. Then I asked around, someone introduced me to Mr. Hearns, and then he and I went out. And then we found it, and this is one of the stones, an unmarked stone. In the end, we did find a stone for his sister Marion, who had died when he was a very young boy, and he had not been back to her gravesite since her funeral, which now would have been 85, 90 years ago. So very important to relocate these sites, and then so that we can learn from them. There is another way to try to ascertain where someone was buried, and that's especially after the 19-teens, when the Bureau of Vital Statistics in Virginia started issuing death certificates more regularly. This is an example from another local cemetery, the Daughters of Zion Cemetery, right in downtown Charlottesville. And we have some of the experts about that cemetery on the call tonight. But this is an example on death certificates, at least in the state of Virginia, and I'm pretty certain this will hold true for almost every other state. You'll see in the lower right-hand corner the place of burial, date of burial, the undertaker. And so in this case, there is a little bit of deciphering that has to occur, because sometimes it'll say it'll just say family cemetery. So I don't want to, it's not that death certificates usually have addresses for these historic sites, but usually with a little bit of research, that it will certainly help you in relocating where someone's buried. So in this particular case, I just referred to it as the Daughters of Zion Cemetery, but it in turn had multiple historic names, one of which was the Society Cemetery. And indeed, this is Nancy Baker Carey's gravestone, where she's buried with her husband. So especially, I always kind of gear this talk in part, not just for the site that I'm kind of talking about in particular. So in other words, tonight, the cemetery at Ivy Creek, but assuming that some of you who are tuning in, maybe are either trying to locate your own family cemeteries or learn from them, or that maybe in your community, you also have ongoing efforts to locate these sites. So of course, a key element to this is, even if you have a sense of geographically where a cemetery is, you have to know what you're looking for. So as you can see here, that the range of these stones, there's a huge range, both in terms of material type, the inscription type, the morphology. This is an example of a hand-carved one. And then here's some of the range that we have, again, moving from left to right. These metal markers, these are funeral home markers. They're meant to be impermanent or temporary between the funeral and when you can afford to buy the stone. But in some cases, families leave, they don't ever have the resources to buy a stone, so the metal marker remains. And unfortunately, these markers, very often the information about the deceased was on a piece of paper, sometimes underneath a piece of glass, and those don't preserve very well. So they can help locate where a burial must be, but they don't always have the biographical information preserved. We're going to come back to the second example here, because that's, of course, two of the obelisks that are at Ivy Creek. Then you have this anthropomorphic shape, but otherwise uninscribed. Then this is a small marble marker with only partial biographical information. And then as we move into the 20th century, we get these granite markers that both tend to be more permanent because they're made out of granite, and then they have a lot more biographical information on them. So as I just mentioned, at Ivy Creek, for those of you who have not had a chance to visit the site, it's a historic farmstead owned by a Black family over multiple generations. And at this site, the stones we're about to talk about, these are a series of 20th century stones right here, all granite in a concrete enclosure. There is one more stone that you can't, actually there's a couple more stones that you can't see within the enclosure, but the picture of these two obelisks, you can see in this one picture in the background. So this is an interesting pattern where you have two different morphologies, these carved granite markers that are done by professional stone carvers. And then, so these represent multiple generations. I will point out, it is always really important, especially when you have spouses or siblings buried on the same stone. In this particular case, you see Hugh Carr and his wife and their son. But in terms of who was buried first, it obviously would have been Texie Hawkins, because she's died in 1899. The historic records show us that the first time that Hugh Carr formally sets aside this location as a graveyard is actually 1913. In other words, just the year before he dies. I can also tell you, based on the shape, that's not just the shape, but the fact that this is granite and the way it's carved, this style is more of a, this is a style that's more common in the 20th century, because it's much harder to carve granite than marble. And so it takes a while for, in America, for us to have the sort of carving technology to carve in granite. And I say all this because, in other words, if this stone was designed and erected when Texie died, the first individual, that would mean they would have had to know how to leave just the right space for people who are going to die, up to 17 years after her death. That is not what happened here. In fact, most likely what happened with all three of these individuals, who are, again, dying at all different times, but the stone looks like it was carved at one moment in time, is that this was maybe a replacement stone for earlier stones, if that all makes sense. And one of the many reasons why I say that, if now we look at these obelisks, which, by the way, they don't have dates, they don't have names, there is nothing identifying on these obelisks. These obelisks, by the way, the morphology of them with their carved tops is that of very similar to West African obelisks. In other words, not the Egyptian style obelisks, which tend to have a pyramidion on top, which is a equilateral triangle. These are more in keeping with West African traditions. So these are almost certainly earlier burials than the individuals, certainly than the granite markers. And one theory that I've always had, one of two theories: either this is Hugh Carr's mother, Fanny Carr, who died in the late 19th century. So in other words, she probably would have been one of the first people buried here to start a cemetery. Or it's possibly Texie Carr, who was buried there, and then later they're commemorating her on this later style and erected much later gravestone. So even when you have dates on stone, sometimes there are also other things going on in terms of when stones were actually erected. So other patterns in grave markers and historic Black cemeteries, hand inscribed. So this is a soapstone marker. Actually, sorry, this is schist. But here, if you read it, it's Callie, C-A-L-L-Y, and then a backwards S. And then she died July 10th, 1865. So just after the end of the Civil War. And this is a very, it's only about a foot high. So again, these are the sorts of markers that are very hard to relocate when you're looking for these historic slave cemeteries. I mentioned at the beginning, and I showed those pictures of some of the flowers and the plantings in these cemeteries, because sometimes it's the plantings that lead you to where the cemetery is. So in this particular case, this individual burial, it has one of the metal funeral home markers I mentioned. You can even see the cracked glass. So unfortunately, the paper is illegible in this case, but they planted tulips. And then, by the way, these are fake flowers. These are not real flowers. But so this assemblage marks a burial. And in this location, there's no preserved marker whatsoever, but you can see the indent graves before. Modern day graves don't normally, you don't normally get this dip in the soil, because people are in coffins that are solid, that take a long time to decay. In the 19th century, with a traditional wooden box, the box is going to decay, the body's going to decay, and then you eventually get these depressions, which, even though they're usually not terribly deep, but it does make a difference in collecting things like dead leaves or snow, like the last place that snow melts, because it's a little bit deeper, so the ground is a teeny bit colder. So this is, again, an example at Montpelier Cemetery for Enslaved Families, and each one of these areas is a burial, but otherwise, in most cases, unmarked by a stone. Returning to this important site in Charlottesville, the Daughters of Zion Cemetery, and I can put in the chat at the end I know at least a couple of people on this call can put on in the URL to their website and or their Facebook page. The preservers of the Daughters of Cemetery have worked ceaselessly to research the individuals buried here. Here showing just, a small portion of the work that they continue to do. What you're looking at here on the left is a map, an old map that I drew back in '04 of where the visible stones were. And in contrast, when they returned later and working with Ravenna Archaeological Associates, if you look at this, I know the orientation changes, but if you look at the orange oval, which is the same in both maps, this was an initial study they did using ground penetrating radar. And in contrast to it's a couple hundred, but the couple hundred stones, there are hundreds and hundreds of more individuals buried here. And you see that that's where these white outlines are the interpretations of the GPR, where there might be additional burials. So, a lot of people talk about using GPR in these historic sites. It can be a very powerful tool, but to be clear, it's GPR by itself doesn't show you skeletons or even coffins. It just shows you where disturbances are in the ground that then can be interpreted in various ways. So all of this effort, relocating these sites, why are they important? Well, there's a tremendous amount we can learn from these stones. Both here, two examples. One is a World War I veteran, an African-American man who was lost on a ship during the war. And then on the right-hand side, Charles Sellers, when you read his epitaph, it reads, he spent his life of about 80 years in faithful service in the family of Astuteville. Astuteville is connected to a plantation here in Albemarle. This is actually in a church, a neighborhood cemetery, a little ways away from the plantation, because he's dying, of course, 50 years after emancipation. So that inscription is one of the only things that's going to tie him, and therefore his parents, his grandparents potentially, back to this other plantation site. So there's lots of generational tracking that you can do using epitaphs from gravestones. Similarly, at another site in Albemarle, a different plantation, again, a hand-carved stone with an exceptionally lengthy inscription. The stone is on the left. An interpretation of this is on the right. I do not claim I certainly cannot interpret most of this, but you do start seeing dates, and you also start seeing some repetitive, this AWA, either AMA, they're AMMA, maybe ANN, some version of anno for year. There's just lots of different ways to interpret this, but certainly is a rich source for, with additional interpretations, trying to understand what this inscription said. And then, even though these stones, of course, are critically important, they provide a lot of information. The stones are only a portion of the mortuary landscape writ large. In other words, funerals, mourning, wakes. So here, now turning to the archival evidence, on the left-hand side is late 19th century drawing of a funeral, a historic Black funeral. You can see the coffin. It's a hexagonal coffin in this case, being carried, and then you can see the sextant or the gravedigger in the foreground, ready to, holding up a torch, ready to meet the pallbearers. I would add this particular image, the idea that this is being done at night. This is a pattern that began during slavery, because many enslavers either weren't giving the enslaved community time off to bury their dead, and or by selecting, very often funerals for enslaved individuals were held at midnight, because midnight is symbolically very important. It's betwixt and between night and day. So it has a lot of symbolic resonance with passing on to another, obviously, realm. And then it also gave individuals freedom from, in most cases at that time of night, spying by their enslavers or interference. And in turn, funerals during the antebellum period for the Black community in many cases was it was a period of mourning, but it was also a period where many individuals were able to come together, families that otherwise were separated potentially on different plantations. So very important moments in terms of funerals and community gatherings. And you see this reference on the right-hand side, another reference of an antebellum Black burial and an individual preaching and members of the community coming together during this time. What's also missing, again, this accompaniment to the stones themselves is it's always important to pay attention to the trees, the oldest trees in a cemetery, because as you saw in that very first slide about with the orange flags, although you couldn't see the tree very well, the reason why those stones ended up clustered at that tree is that is probably a 150-year-old tree. So it had been there all that time, and it made sense to cluster the stones out of the way. Well, it didn't make sense to do it because it was desecration, but it was a location to that the cows wouldn't run into. And then, of course, we're missing from the stones the richness of the funerary tradition, funeral rites. And as just one example, a noted local educator and principal here in there where some of you are in Charlottesville, Benjamin Tonsler. This is his grave in the center. He was buried at the Daughters of Zion Cemetery. But then going left to right, the left-hand side is a photo from the Halsinger collection. And that is a photograph of the deceased, Principal Tonsler, and then all of the mourning flowers that people have brought for him. This is, of course, a tradition that is, well, it actually depends on your religious background and ethnic background. These sort of mourning flowers and mourning wreaths are not as popular anymore, but in the 19th century and early 20th century, they were very popular, especially for important members of the community. And then on the right-hand side, as part of the complete kind of package here, is the house that Mr. Tonsler lived in, near to the cemetery. And as I said in the very beginning, if you are looking for historic cemeteries, people aren't always buried near their homes, but it's certainly, especially in the 19th century, and before cars, it is a very good place to begin, because most people in the 18th, 19th centuries, they never went more than, say, 10 or 15 miles away from their homes, and almost certainly they're buried within that radius as well. And then grave offerings, and this is just a quick cautionary mention. If you are working with these historic cemeteries and you're trying to clean them, in some cases, especially here in the South, they have gotten extremely overgrown, and there is a tremendous amount of work that goes into maintaining them. But just to be careful, even with things like leaf blowers, that in some cases there are very intentional offerings on the graves that you don't want to, clean up or blow away through a leaf blower. And in the case on the left-hand side, in many cases, these offerings hint at various West African traditions, broken mirrors, any number of different traditions. So as I end out my comments before taking questions, I've kind of been alluding to this all throughout the talk, but unfortunately, many of these, especially 19th century historic Black cemeteries, are at risk. Certainly here in Virginia, but also I know areas in Florida where there's a lot of great work being done. And here, some of you I'm sure saw this, the Columbia and Harmony Cemetery in DC. Climate change was partly to blame here, but then it was frankly neglect of local authorities for a site over time. Cemeteries, large cemeteries that communities are regularly maintaining are not falling into rivers. And then there's another just remarkable example in Richmond of the African burying ground where tens of thousands of individuals are buried. But then in the mid-20th century, with the interstate system, the interstate was put right through the cemetery, and individuals like Lenore McQueen and others are hard at work to recapture the history of the individuals buried here, research who is buried here, and ongoing work in the present by the city of Richmond and other partners to develop an interpretive center in this region to talk about the history of this important cemetery. Again, referred to this at the beginning. If you're in a different state and you are working on these sites, I encourage you to look up your statutes because they do vary from, these are state statutes, not federal. But here in Virginia, there are a series of laws that are meant to protect, like to prevent the desecration of these sacred sites. And then, as I mentioned before, this statute 5727, the access to cemeteries located in private property. And they're, unlike what Mr. Hearns was told, there is a process for getting access to family cemeteries on private land. And I wanted to end on kind of a, not just maybe a hopeful note, but also, you know, what can communities do, families do? You have these historic sites, they're critically important, but perhaps they've been overlooked at various points in your community's history. You know, sponsoring, hosting rituals of remembrance at these sites can be a really important way to kind of knit together the memory of the individuals buried there, the importance of these communities and their history, their continuing history and history in the present. So here's an example, turning back to Sweet Briar College, where I worked for 18 years. On the left-hand side, you can see these are, again, unmarked stones. There's no inscriptions on them in a cemetery for enslaved families at Sweet Briar. There's over 50 people buried in the cemetery. And the individuals that you're looking at years ago, and actually on multiple occasions, we hosted the descendants of some of the individuals buried in the cemetery. In this case, the Fletcher, Rose, Jones families. And on the right-hand side, these are members, the descendants of these families holding a libation ceremony at this site in remembrance of their ancestors. And then similarly, the Daughters of Zion Cemetery, that actually is just, this is an older photograph from a couple of years ago, but every year at Memorial Day holds Memorial Day, which also in the past was referred to as Decoration Day. So literally visiting these sites, bringing families, bringing food, and remembering the dead. You know, really powerful way to preserve these histories at these different sites. Throughout this, we always have to engage the next generation, the younger generations, to care about this. You know, I think it's safe to say right now we probably don't have anyone under 18 on this call, but we have to always be reaching out to those younger generations. So, you know, in Charlottesville, I was often working with the graduate students at Curry, graduate students in education. In other words, teaching the people who are planning to be K through 12 teachers how to integrate these sites into their lesson plans, because all, you know, across the country, all schools have access, all schools are in communities that have cemeteries, and most schools are in communities that have historic African-American cemeteries. So it's a really great way to, again, combine local history, trying to preserve these sites, remember the individuals buried in them, and hopefully help preserve them. So that is where I will end. If you're still interested in this topic, I wrote a book a number of years ago that's meant to be a lot like this talk, a kind of a guidebook to relocating cemeteries, the stories they can tell us, how to preserve them, how to work with communities and descendants. And that's this book, Hidden History. But I will stop there, and I will stop sharing so I can see again. And then happy to take questions. And Susie, why don't, it would help just until I catch up with who has asked questions. Oh, now I see.
So one of the questions is that they recently found a cemetery in Whitehall with 2 headstones for the Hawkins family, who would have been related to Texie Mae Hawkins Carr, Mr. Carr's wife. The question is being whether this was likely the cemetery of antebellum Hawkins, or did white land and slave owning families bury white family members with simple field stones?
So it is a great question. And I mean, if I think about, correct me when I rephrase it, if I'm not answering the person's question, they should feel free to ask it, to keep asking it. But having a marker that is uninscribed, like a locally available field stone that is like many of the photos I showed, that is not inscribed, that in and of itself, that is not unique to Black cemeteries. So I think what the question is getting at is, just because you find an uninscribed stones, that doesn't mean it's a Black cemetery. And it certainly doesn't mean it's necessarily antebellum cemetery, because even to the present, like unmarked and uninscribed stones usually correlate in some way with lack of resources and most likely poverty. So lots of different groups can have these unmarked cemeteries. So that's why the cultural context is critically important. So it isn't that you can just, go for a walk in the woods, you find some unmarked stones, and you think you have either a Black cemetery or a cemetery for enslaved families. There has to be, all the examples I showed were in association with a plantation, an enslaved community, a post-bellum Black community, Black churches, there have to be some other clues for why it might be a Black family. And in the case of the Hawkins, because they're in Albemarle, white Hawkins and Black Hawkins, you would have to continue to do work to figure out, which part of the family it was, if I'm understanding their question correctly. Yeah.
It is on an old plantation.
Thank you, Dee Dee. I recognize your voice. Yes. So in that case, and then for the last part of this, did white land and slave family bury? Oh, well, I would just add, even though this isn't quite the question, but so then there's another pattern that I didn't talk about as much here, but there is a pattern whereby, and actually you see this in Charlottesville at Penn Park, where you can have a white cemetery. Most of the examples I just showed were separate freestanding African-American cemeteries. There's another pattern that also corresponds to former plantations, where the white family has their cemetery, and then sometimes African Americans are buried just outside of the walls of the white cemetery. Occasionally, some members of the African American community are buried within the white family cemetery. And then the third pattern is white cemetery and then separate Black cemetery, but in association with each other. In fact, to put it a different way, sometimes on some of these former plantations, if the location of the cemetery for enslaved families was really lost, I mean, to the historic record anyway, the place to start is to find the white cemetery, which is usually easier to find because the markers, usually if you're white and you own a plantation, you usually have the resources to buy formally carved markers that tend to be like the obelisks, things that are taller, easier to relocate, even if the cemetery is overgrown. And then you start from that spot, and then you start doing like basically radiuses of searching, looking for where the Black cemetery is. I see. So just from I see some questions about, the second, those other two obelisks, and I forgot to say an important things there. So there were clearly two of them, as you would have seen in the photo, but there's two ways to interpret that. They could be a headstone and a footstone. So in other words, one burial, two markers, or they could be two individuals buried, right kind of in line with each other. There's no way for me to prove this, but just based on seeing tens of thousands of examples of footstones and headstones, it is much more likely that this is one person with a headstone and a footstone, because it would be unusual when whoever is buried here, clearly they were there long before they put in that concrete rectangle or the granite markers. So in other words, you have to imagine when it was empty space and they go to bury the first person, whoever it is, they have all that space they can use. And so then to put two people so close to it, they might go side by side, but they wouldn't go head to foot like that. So it is probably one person. And as Dee Dee mentions here, the family history relates that it's most likely Hugh's mother, Fanny Carr. So as I alluded to, she then would have been buried. I believe she died in the 1890s. So she is the first burial And then from there, the family refines the space and makes the concrete marker. Mr. Brooks, I see your hand up.
Yes, kind of a niche question, but there was a period where I guess in the late 1890s, post Reconstruction, some of the African American churches were just being built, and they didn't always have the cemeteries or the land. Like even there at Riverview, I'm not sure when Union Ridge Church was established, but the cemetery is kind of down the road a little bit.
Yes.
And I have a situation like that where the church in Keene, Southern Albemarle, was built. There is a cemetery there, but my family is like a half a mile or a mile away, and what we thought was a private lot. And my family did preserve that lot, but we always noticed a couple of other headstones in the area. And then we had an adjacent landowner who said, no, there's at least 50 people buried here. And just watched with great interest some of the things you talked about with depressions and flowers. Do you know if there was ever like African Americans that were buried near like a brush arbor or something? Because I thought my family owned this lot, and I actually now have found that they never owned it. But there's like groups of people buried there, and it's separate from where the original church cemetery is, and I can't figure it out. I just thought it was a family plot, but there's groups of people there with no evidence of a church ever having been in that particular area.
So what I will do actually, because those are a lot of great questions embedded in here. I am going to send you right now, if you look at the chat, my email, if I can, that's my email. Because that's the sort of, for that very specific question, it would help to have, maybe some photographs of individual stones, but I can just tell you that what you're describing, it is probably a combination of maybe a neighborhood. There's also neighborhood cemeteries that are not necessarily near a church, and they're certainly not like a churchyard. They really are a separate. And Keene is a good example of that. In fact, I think when you email me and we figure out exactly where you're talking about, it is possibly a spot that I have visited. So yes, I've just given you my email.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you, Susie. Yeah, Union Ridge Baptist Church was founded right after the Civil War, so 1868. So someone is asking about this, and it's a great article, this ProPublica article about the disparate treatment between historic Black cemeteries. It's what I alluded to with the Harmony Cemetery in DC. In fact, in Virginia, not just white and Black cemeteries, but starting more than 100 years ago, the state of Virginia had set aside $5 per Confederate grave to help restore Confederate graves. And it has only been in the last really couple of years that the Virginian legislature has started passing bills to set aside money for historic Black cemeteries. I can tell you, if you do the math, and Brian Palmer, one of my friends and colleagues, has done the math in some of his articles on the subject. If you, however, add up the $5 per grave, over the last 100 years, the state is doing a great job now trying to, increase the size of the grants that people in Virginia can apply if they are trying to restore a historic Black cemetery. But we still have a long way to go to bring this back to anything equitable. And so indeed, this link that Melanie put in the chat, it's a great article. And in terms of her question about if there's any efforts, more equitable treatment since then, there are efforts to pass more. The legislation has been passed, but passing budgets that go with the legislation, that is continuing in bits and starts, having to do with budget cycles. But really, I think the most important thing that's happened since that article is more of a nationwide effort to establish a database. For those of you familiar with NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which was passed in the 90s to help protect Native American graves, this is the modern day version of that, but for African American sites. And that has gone through committees in Congress and the House. It is passing as legislation, but it does not yet have a budget with it. So in other words, that is still in progress, but people are actively working to try to pass a nationwide bill so that there would be a nationwide database of these sites to try to protect them. Folks are mentioning, Monticello's Digital Archaeological Archive of Comparative Slavery. I mean, I've been chatting with those folks, for 20 years. They themselves, that archive is actually focused on artifacts, not as much these sites. But at Monticello, the archaeologists there, of course, there is a cemetery for enslaved families right below Jefferson's graveyard. Unfortunately, it is located within the middle of the parking lot. But Monticello has been doing a great job for at least a decade now to add interpretation, working with descendants, collecting stories, doing GPR, and in all the acreage of Monticello, they continue to deploy GPR and archaeological research to try to locate. That is certainly not the only cemetery for enslaved individuals. I believe Jefferson owned 600 people during his lifetime, and that one cemetery, there clearly were other cemeteries there.
And that came up because of a question that was asked earlier that you might have missed. The question was, what suggestions do you have for private landowners who care to honor, protect these sites and are willing to support site research to get assistance, find interested partners?
Now I see. Well, it can't hurt to ask. It's called DAX. That's the acronym for that. I don't think they would probably be the ones to help you, but the other person who mentions, doesn't someone mention Joanna here at DHR? I thought someone mentioned her. So the place to start is the Department of Historic Resources, at least here in Virginia, the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. They have Joanna Wilson. They have a cemetery division. Now you can imagine, because they're the state, I mean, they get maybe hundreds, if not thousands of questions a year, but they have, if you go to the DHR website, they do have a series of resources for protecting these sites. Like one of the things I talk about in my book, if you are a landowner, a private landowner, one of the first things you could do that would be very helpful is if that cemetery is not located on your deed to your property, pay a surveyor, get it onto your deed legally, because not all the time, but much of the time, part of the challenge here is that someone will buy land and they really do not know that there is a cemetery on that site, because it has been generations since someone brought it to anyone's attention. And that's where, of course, the trouble starts, because if you buy land and you're just, I'm going to put my house here, and then later you find there's a cemetery there, that is not the order of events here. So, and to be clear, or to clarify, in the 19th century, there were deeds, of course, in the 19th century, but very few of those deeds recorded when there was a black cemetery at a site. So in the present, one of the first things you can do is put it onto your deed, have it surveyed so that you know where the boundaries are, to make sure that it's protected, that no one builds on it. And then Joanna Green, sorry, sometimes I mix up her surname, I feel so badly. It's Joanna Green. It is a Joanna who works.
It is Joanna Green. And I'm going to put her contact information in the chat because she is absolutely dedicated and amazing.
Thank you, Joanna Green. Sorry, there's also a Joanna Wilson who works there, but specializes in something different.
She's actually Joanna Wilson Green.
Oh, it's the same person. Oh my gosh. On one hand, I feel like an idiot, but on the other hand, I feel so much better that that it's actually this, that I have the name right. I just didn't put it together. So yes, that would be talking to her. And again, she has resources online for how to manage that. Okay, now I'm really losing track of where the questions. Earlier documentation or mention of graveyard. Oh, so then there's a question about at Sweet Briar, had there been an earlier mention or documentation of this graveyard? Well, the short answer is yes, actually. However, like the mention archivally of this graveyard in the 19th century was one mention in a letter from the plantation owner, Elijah Fletcher, which I found, but I mean, I had to go through 150 pages of his letters to find this one reference. And then the one reference, of course, doesn't specify where in the plantation the graveyard is. So that was one moment of like knowing there was a cemetery here somewhere. In the 1970s, actually a student at Sweet Briar had run across it, wasn't entirely sure what it was, but wrote, one of these student like honors papers. But then that was, handed in and like basically lost in the archives and no one had looked at it. And then we fast forward to when I arrived 20 years ago. Actually, in that case, that was actually that was really the first cemetery I studied. So I didn't go out and find it because I wouldn't have known where to look. It was a retiring, it was the head of the riding program who, of course, had spent thousands of hours riding all over the property. Sweet Briar has 3,000 acres connected with it. And he had run across this. And as he was retiring, he had shared with a then dean, I think it's a cemetery. I don't know who to tell, but I'll start with you. And then she in turn turned to me. So there were these small little clues, but it wasn't, for example, on a deed or, on a map in any straightforward way. All right, Susie, how am I doing? Have I missed some stuff in here?
I think you got most of it. A new message just popped up. Oh, yeah, Lorna asked a question about Ivy Creek and historic Riverview Farm.
Oh,
Where did that go? Oh, could you talk about your work at Ivy Creek Natural Area and historic Riverview Farm and the map that you made and what else might be learned at our site?
Oh, well, here I really have to defer. So I visited Ivy Creek probably in 2006. And around that time, actually, I did a couple of things. First, I had a small grant from Virginia Humanities, and I went out with a bunch of other archaeological colleagues, and we actually walked. We did a survey of the land. And by survey, I mean, in other words, not just hike the trails, but we walked north-south transects as a group, like all together in a line. And as we were doing that, we were marking down anytime we saw anything that could be a site, not a burial, but a former house site, old chimney, evidence of an old trash dump. I mean, anything really. So in that sense, I'd spent a lot of time walking all over the acreage at Ivy Creek, but the cemetery in particular, again, I did some initial research, but when I was studying the cemetery at Ivy Creek, that was one of 180 cemeteries that I was visiting, collecting information for this book and to try to put together this idea of recommendations for people. So again, I am certainly not the expert. And in fact, of course, the expert on that site are the descendants. And I know for a fact, I think in 2005, and I think that was the first time Ivy Creek as a foundation invited descendants back. Susie, Mariah, do you know if I have my date right?
It was a 2005 family reunion. I'm not sure it was the first. I was in charge of that, and I don't want to claim it was the first, but it was a really important one. And there is a grandson who was alive at that time who really was the leader in forming that, who is now buried in the cemetery, family cemetery, which is another interesting facet of this, is that the family does own that, and he was entitled, and Parks and Rec was wonderful about accommodating that. But that was 2005 was the family reunion.
Right. So yes, in other words, ongoing research. I mean, Susie and her team, continuing to look for grants so that they can do GPR, make sure that, the thing with these historic cemeteries though, you look at the concrete enclosure and you think, well, other than the two obelisks, all the burials are probably in there, but you may, if you've been looking at some of the pictures I showed, it is very common, not I shouldn't say very common, but one of the patterns is that you'll have a perimeter around a family plot, but that doesn't mean it's the perimeter for the entire cemetery. So that perimeter around the cars, there could be other folks buried out, not just under the obelisks, but folks buried outside of that. So, I would say it's definitely a work in progress to establish how many people are buried there. And then, of course, continue to work with descendants and collecting stories and information about the people buried in the cemetery.
Yeah, and we're continuing to do that, and we're working to try to find the funding to see if we can maybe get some archaeological work done to find out how many people might be buried in that area as well.
There was also Parks and Rec also hired some other, at some point, in those many, many, many years, some cemetery expert they brought in who did, I mean, and Lynn, you did this too. I know of your 180 cemeteries you were looking at. It's probably hard to conjure just back one, but I remember that well. So you as well as this other cemetery person did see the depressions outside of that concrete barrier. I mean, it's very likely that even some of the people who are on those headstones might be there. And I would just like to say that again, to talk about Joanna Wilson Green, she's been incredibly useful. I've been working with her in other Black cemeteries that belong to churches, and they have a fund. They don't talk a lot about this fund that actually will fund GPR surveys. I mean, they're working, I don't know if they'll do it for something owned by a municipality like Ivy Creek, but they just gave the funds to restore 21 headstones at a small church in Whitehall. So it's worth talking to her. I just highly recommend anybody who is working with this to talk to Joanna Green.
Yes, and I will put the fund that Dee Dee just mentioned. I'll put the link. I just put the link to that in the chat for those of you who are in Virginia. Anyway, well, I think, what? Yes.
GPR is very expensive. It's
Yes.
a very expensive project. It can cost you up to $100,000 to do a cemetery.
Yep.
And I know my dad was a mortician, and at times we'd go to the cemetery and they'd be digging a grave, and they would actually dig down on the remains, which were skeletal, of people who were buried there. And nobody knew that was really a grave, especially in the very rural areas.
Yep. Yes, you're entirely correct. In fact, my recommendation to folks for GPR is that the good news is a lot of larger universities, GPR is used by geologists, archaeologists, and so sometimes large universities, sometimes small, but if you have a nearby university that might be trying to train their students in using GPR, sometimes you can get folks to volunteer their time, because the equipment alone is still $50,000 or more just for the machine, and then you do have to know how to use it, and to do the interpretation, you need training. It's not like you just get an X-ray and you look at it. So yes, it is not your go-to. It is not the first thing you try. And yes, in the 19th century and into, really up until World War II, there just weren't usually maps for these especially rural cemeteries. And so, yes, it was very common. In fact, I've talked to many, many, many sextons who are, that's how you found out in part where the next space was. You dug down. If you hit a body, you moved to the right or the left. And I mean, you obviously, but you don't. I mean, you bury, you put the dirt back on. But and I want to clarify one last thing. When we talk about archaeology and cemeteries, while there are examples of people like using archaeology to dig up bodies, like kind of maybe your stereotypical archaeologist, there's plenty of great work that folks like Ravenna Archaeological Associates do, where you're peeling off like an inch or two of soil. In other words, you're not disturbing human remains, but you're peeling off the soil. And then what that allows you to do is see, anytime you dig any hole, post hole, a grave, it'll discolor the soil. And you can see that later. I mean, this is what archaeologists do. This is kind of our bread and butter of how we interpret what we're digging. So I just want to clarify that if people are saying they're doing archaeology, it doesn't mean necessarily like, disturbing graves. And then there's one last question. What items might have been left as mementos? Anything from, personal belongings connected to the deceased, but also mirrors, broken mirrors. The idea of the broken part is to make sure that the soul is released. Ceramics, again, ceramic vessels, sometimes deliberately broken so that, to release the soul. It varies, by the way, tremendously as you go into the deeper South. There are lots of other traditions. And is there a pattern about how close they would have been to the quarters, the slave quarters? There's not one pattern. The only pattern that really holds true is that if you're looking at an antebellum cemetery for enslaved families, it's probably not going to be more than half a mile or a mile away, in part because of logistics of moving bodies, especially because you have to, in those days, pretty much use a horse-drawn carriage, or people are, pallbearers are carrying it. But there is no one, it's not a directional, like a cardinal directions thing, or that's why you have to use these other clues, maybe on a high point, a high hilltop, sometimes close to water, because the idea of crossing over the River Jordan, these trees, looking for cypress trees or cedar trees or yucca plants, like just using all the, I have spent for some of these sites, like the one with Mr. Hearns, you can spend 5-6 hours, like you're in the right vicinity, but you still need to sort out these clues to relocate the stones. So of course I would strongly, if you are doing this, do it in the winter. I learned this the hard way. Because I was at that point a professor. So of course it was my summers that I had kind of off. So I was always doing this in the summertime, hence all those pictures of, vegetation. Don't do that. Do it in the winter. That it's much easier to see things. And then opinion about magnetic technology to look for unmarked graves. No, because I haven't seen, well, first off, there's all different types of, even in addition to GPR, there's other types of radar and electrical magnetic resistivity. None of it is fail-safe. None of it just narrows in on, like, this must be a grave. All of it, whether it's electrical magnetivity or GPR, it's giving you disturbances in the grave. Disturbances in the soil. So for example, trees that have been uprooted also produce patterns that you see in GPR, that you see in electrical resistivity. So it's the reason to use electrical resistivity as opposed to GPR has to do with the soil, like if there's bedrock soil, it has to do with the specifics of the site that you are working on. There is one other thing I would add, though, that there's not a lot of scientific data on this yet, but people are trying to train cadaver dogs to locate, much older cemeteries. We obviously know from, dogs rescuing people in disasters, they're really, really good at finding people and or recently deceased individuals. But I do know there are some folks on the Eastern Seaboard that have highly, highly trained dogs that they say are really good at relocating, 100, 200-year-old cemeteries. I'm not sure how that those might just be some exceptional dogs there, because they do it's 50 times, I think, our sense of smell. Dogs are incredible. I love dogs, but I'm not positive that's refined where realistically you'd be like, you could go for a walk in the woods with dogs and relocate these cemeteries. Not unless you already had a really good idea where the cemetery was. Yes, and Miss Whitsett Hammond reminds us that so the map that I showed of the GPR was an earlier one done by, I believe that one was sponsored by Ravenna Archaeological Associates, but the one, that's why you need to go to the website. Oh, do we have we put that in there? The Daughters of Zion website, where they have all of their ongoing research, and that includes the NEVA, the report that she is mentioning. So there, the Daughters of Zion website, and they also have an accompanying Facebook page. Oh, anywhere to hire the dogs? I don't off the top of my head. Yeah, you'd have to ask Montpelier, because I myself have never. They're not only available to law enforcement, but because I know there's Montpelier might know, Monticello might know. It's someone I've seen at conferences. I've actually never seen the dogs. Dogs weren't at the conference, but the owner was. There is someone who is doing this with dogs for old cemeteries, but unfortunately, I have not worked with her, and I don't unfortunately know her. Although honestly, I bet if you Google it, you will find her, because I think she, she is promoting her work. Oh. Yeah, kind of like Joanna Wilson Green. So Ravenna Archaeological was working with NEVA. So, and there's the website for Ravenna Archaeological Services. well, I don't want to hold everyone any longer on a Wednesday night. Susie, where are you? Because I know you wanted to say a couple things.
Yeah, I just would like to thank you for doing this talk this evening. And I want to thank everyone who joined us. We hope that if you have not visited Ivy Creek Natural Area and Historic Riverview Farm, that you will do so soon. We are going to have 2 Riverview Farm tours planned for Juneteenth. If you would like to come to the site and learn more about the Card-Greer family, their contributions to their community, and their legacies, we hope that you will join us on those tours. More information about that can be found on our website. Our next Ivy Talk will take place on July 19th from 6:30 to 8 o'clock p.m. Dr. Will Kurtz will be presenting Black Virginians in Blue, the Untold Stories of Albemarle County's U.S. Colored Troops, which tells the story of more than 250 Black men from Albemarle County and Charlottesville, Virginia, who served in the Union Army or Navy during the American Civil War. And you can sign up for that Ivy Talk just like you did for this one. As always, these talks are free and open to the public. We also hope that if you enjoyed this talk and would like to support what we are doing for our community, please consider going to our website and making a donation today. That's ivycreekfoundation.org. Otherwise, thank you all for joining us and have a great rest of your evening.